So in this lesson, I'm going to look at the GCSE biology topic of the human nervous system. So you should know that receptors are differentiated cells that detect changes in your environment, and we call those changes in the environment the stimuli. Now that could be the change in light. Now that would be detected by receptors in your eye. It could be chemicals such as you smelling something or tasting something, or it could be sound as I talk to you right now, or me changing the position of my body, moving my head in different directions. It could be somebody touches you on the shoulder or the hand, pressure as you sit on a table, or pain, or the temperature of the environment. So you have these different types of receptors, and they are located in different places within the body. So when they detect a change in the environment, what they will then do is pass that information on to your nervous system. Now, your nervous system is composed of, again, differentiated cells, and these differentiated cells are called neurons. Now, these neurons are able to transmit rapid electrical impulses all over the body. So they are cells. Therefore, they have a cell body, and inside that cell body, they have a nucleus. Now, this neuron that we're looking at is called a sensory neuron because it is connected to the senses. It is connected to where the receptors are. The receptors that are going to be sensing the changes in the environment. So it's really important that we look at a few things to do with these neurons. And the first thing to know is that our electrical impulse will be transmitted towards the cell body, and then it will be transmitted away from the cell body. So this rapid electrical impulse that's transmitted goes all the way from one end of the neuron right the way down to the end of the neuron. And therefore what we know is a way in which we can speed up the transmission, the rapid electrical impulse, is through the use of what's known as a myelin sheath. Now, myelin sheath is something that insulates the neuron and therefore makes it able to transmit that electrical impulse really quickly. So what you need to know is that your sensory neurons are transmitting the nerve impulse from the receptor to the central nervous system. So how does it do that? Well, it's important to note that when we come to the end of a sensory neuron, once the electrical impulse arrives at the end of that sensory neuron, there's actually a gap. And that's a really small gap, which is called the synapse. So this electrical impulse has come down my sensory neuron. It cannot get across the gap. The electrical impulse is not able to jump the gap, and therefore what needs to happen is the sensory neuron is going to have inside it chemical messengers. These are called neurotransmitters, and what will happen is these neurotransmitters are going to be released into the synapse. And what those neurotransmitters can do is they can diffuse across the synapse. Remember diffusion, moving from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. So once those neurotransmitters have been released from that sensory neuron, they can then move across the synapse, diffuse this passive movement until they reach the next neuron. What that will then do is that will then result in the electrical impulse now being able to be passed down the next neuron. So what you have to understand is that central nervous system, the CNS, is actually made up of two parts. So you have your brain and you have your spinal cord. Now, inside the brain and spinal cord, there are some different types of neurons called relay neurons. And those relay neurons are going to transmit the impulses within the central nervous system. Now, these neurons are really small, so they don't have any myelin sheath on their axons, and that's because they don't need them. But they do pass the impulses on through the release of these neurotransmitters. So once the electrical impulse gets to the end of a relay neuron, to pass it on to the next relay neuron, the neurotransmitters need to be released. So the CNS is actually also known as your coordination center. That's because as it receives the information from receptors, it will process that information and then it will coordinate the response that needs to occur by the effectors. Now, the effectors are your muscles, which are going to be able to contract and relax, or they could be glands, and those glands will secrete enzymes or hormones. So if we actually look at what happens then, we have a stimulus, a change in the environment that is detected by a receptor. That information is then passed on to the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron will conduct that nerve impulse from the receptor to the CNS. That will then pass the information across through the release of neurotransmitters across the synapse to the relay neuron, and the relay neuron will then transmit those impulses within the central nervous system. That will then be passed on to another neuron, which is called a motor neuron. Now, the motor neuron is going to conduct the nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effector. And that effector, as we said before, can either be a gland or a muscle. And the effector is the one which is going to carry out the response. So what do we need to understand? Well, the pathway is really simple if it is known as a reflex arc. So if we are talking about a stimulus being detected by a receptor, going through a sensory neuron and a relay neuron, a motor neuron to the effector, and then the response being carried out, this very simple pathway is known as a reflex arc. Now, a reflex arc is extremely fast. It's few synapses involved. We've got the stimulus being detected by the receptor, the sensory neuron sending the electrical impulse, that being passed on to the relay neuron passing it on to the motor neuron, and the effector carrying out whatever the response may be. Now, because we have very few synapses involved, that is going to help us to prevent any danger from occurring to the body. It is going to happen because there is no conscious part of the brain involved. So it's not a case of it goes sensory neuron to the relay up to the brain and back down the relay to the motor. What's happening is a reflex arc. If we're not using the conscious parts of our brain, they are very quick, extremely fast responses. Very few synapses involved. So a prime example would be your knee-jerk reflex. This is what's known as a spinal reflex, where if you go to the doctors and they hit just under your patella, your kneecap, what will happen is that will be detected by a receptor that will then be passed on to the sensory neuron. That information, the electrical impulse, will be passed to the relay neuron. The relay neuron will then pass that on to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron will pass that on to the muscles, and the muscles will then do the response where they will either contract or they could relax, depending on what is needed and what that response was, that signal that was being passed on.